Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive into compliance.
Ooh, compliance always a fun one.
Well, it's important, right?
Mhm.
Especially if you're thinking about, expanding your business into Europe.
Yeah, Europe's got its own whole set of rules and regulations.
It can be a bit of a maze to navigate,
Definitely.
but that's what we're here for, to kind of break it down.
Exactly. And we've got some great sources here that really dig into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah, some really interesting stuff like, bringing stakeholders up to speed who maybe haven't dealt with European compliance before.
Yeah, that's a big one.
And then there's the whole challenge of managing pushback from teams who
Hmm.
are used to doing things their own way.
Oh, yeah. We've always done it this way. Why change now?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we'll be looking at all of that and more.
And I think one of the things that really jumped out at me from the sources is just how much of an impact compliance issues can have.
Oh, for sure.
Like one source mentioned that almost half of businesses expanding into Europe face significant delays because of compliance issues. Wow, 40%. That's a big chunk
Yeah, it's not just a minor inconvenience. It can really throw a wrench in your plans.
and costs a lot of money, I bet.
Absolutely. Time is money, as they say.
So let's dive into some of the specifics.
Sure.
GDPR, that's the big one, right?
GDPR is definitely the elephant in the room.
But our sources also talk about all those country-specific regulations within Europe.
Oh, yeah, it's not just one size fits all.
Like Germany, for example, they have some pretty strict data retention rules, even more so than some other EU countries.
Right. And that's where it gets really tricky because you're not just dealing with one set of regulations. You've got to keep track of all these different nuances.
Yeah, it must be a headache for businesses trying to keep up with all that.
It's like trying to hit a moving target.
And for employees too, right? I mean, imagine you're on the marketing team and suddenly you have to understand data privacy laws in France versus Germany on top of all your other work.
Yeah, it can be overwhelming, for
Yeah.
sure.
And speaking of employees, one of our sources mentioned that a lot of them find compliance training to be, well, a little dry.
Yeah, boring was the word they used.
Something like 70% of employees surveyed said that compliance training was either boring or irrelevant to their jobs.
Ouch. That's not a good sign.
So how do you actually make compliance training engaging and effective, especially when those regulations are always changing?
Well, I think collaboration is key.
Okay, how so?
Your legal team, they're your best friends in this process.
They usually are.
They can help tailor training programs for different departments because obviously marketing needs a different focus than, say, finance.
Right, makes sense.
And they can make sure that the training stays up to date with the latest regulatory changes.
Okay, so legal can help with the content and the accuracy, but what about the human element?
Ah, yes, the human factor.
Because let's face it, change is hard, and people can be resistant to new procedures, especially if they see it as just more work.
Absolutely. I think we've all heard that we've always done it this way line at some point.
Oh, yeah, countless times.
And that resistance, it's natural. It often comes from a lack of understanding or fear of extra work.
So almost like compliance has a bit of a PR problem.
Maybe it needs a rebrand.
But seriously, how do you get people on board? How do you shift that perspective?
I think it's about framing.
Frey.
Instead of presenting compliance as a burden, we need to highlight the benefits.
Okay, I like that.
For example, strong data protection measures. They're not just about avoiding fines.
Right.
They also build trust with customers.
So it's a win-win.
Exactly. And we actually have a case study here on a tech company called Innovate
Mhm.
that saw a 15% increase in customer retention after implementing a strong compliance program.
Wow, so they actually turned compliance into a competitive advantage.
They did. It's pretty impressive.
That's really smart. But I'm guessing it takes more than just saying, hey, this is good for us to get everyone on board.
You're right. It's about building a culture of compliance.
And what does that look like in practice?
It means everyone understands their role and feels empowered to participate.
Mm.
It means providing solutions, not just rules.
So less stick, more carrot.
Exactly like in the case of Innovate, they didn't just throw a stack of regulations at their employees.
What did they do?
They developed user-friendly tools and resources to make complying easier.
Okay, so that's a good segue into the how.
It is.
Innovate is a great example, but what about other companies, especially those just starting out in the European market? What are some concrete steps they can take?
Well, Innovate did something really interesting that I think is worth highlighting, and Tansy does. They decided to implement things gradually.
Or gradually.
Yeah, instead of trying to change everything at once, they kind of broke it down into phases.
Okay, that makes sense.
So they focused on the most critical areas first, and then built from there.
So like what kind of phases are we talking about?
Well, their first phase was all about data protection.
Makes sense. That's a biggie with GDPR.
Exactly. They made sure everyone understood the basics of data privacy and implemented strict protocols for handling data.
So starting with the essentials.
Yeah, and then in the next phase, they focused on marketing and communications.
Okay, so making sure all their messaging and data collection practices were compliant.
Right, because those areas directly impact customers.
Like they do.
And by breaking it down like that, it just made the whole process less overwhelming for everyone.
Yeah, I can see how that would help.
It's much easier to digest things in smaller chunks.
Right, like eating an elephant one bite at a time.
Exactly.
Speaking of which, you mentioned compliance champions earlier.
I did.
How did Innovate use those?
Oh, that was a really clever tactic.
Oh, yeah.
They basically identified individuals within each department who were passionate about compliance.
So like internal cheerleaders for compliance?
Sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah, but more than just cheerleading, they were real advocates for the program.
Okay, got it.
They helped their colleagues understand the why behind the new procedures, and they provided support during the transition.
So they were kind of like mentors or guides.
Exactly. They even created internal communities where employees could share best practices and get help with compliance-related questions.
So they really fostered a sense of community around compliance.
Yes, it wasn't just a top-down approach. It was very collaborative.
And I bet that made a big difference in terms of buy-in.
Oh, absolutely.
People are more likely to embrace change when they feel like they're part of the process.
Exactly.
So it sounds like Innovate really had a solid plan in place.
They did.
But I'm sure it wasn't all smooth sailing.
Of course not. There were definitely some bumps along the way.
Like what?
Well, even with the phased approach and the compliance champions, some employees were still hesitant to adopt the new tools.
I can imagine.
And some felt like the compliance procedures were slowing them down.
Yeah, the classic, this is too much work complaint.
Exactly. But Innovate didn't just brush those concerns aside.
What did they do?
They listened to their employees, they acknowledged their concerns, and they provided support and training to help them adapt.
So they took a more empathetic approach.
Yes. And they also made a point of communicating regularly and transparently.
Like explaining the reasons behind the changes and how they would benefit everyone.
Exactly. It was all about building trust.
And were they open to feedback?
Oh, absolutely. They were constantly tweaking their approach based on what they were hearing from their employees.
Can you give me an example?
Sure, they realized early on that some of their training materials were too technical and overwhelming,
I can see how that would happen.
so they reworked them to be more user-friendly and engaging.
So they were flexible and responsive.
Exactly. They understood that compliance is a journey, not a destination,
That's a good way to put it.
and that they needed to be constantly learning and adapting.
So it sounds like Innovate really set the bar high in terms of building a successful compliance culture.
They did.
And their story offers some valuable lessons for other companies.
That's what
But it all seems very high touch.
they does.
Can technology play a role in all of this?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, think of all the regulations, all the data. How do you even manage it all?
That's where technology really comes into its own.
So we're not just talking about basic spreadsheets here.
No, we're talking about sophisticated tools that can help you automate processes, identify risks, and ensure compliance.
Give me some examples. Okay, so give me some examples.
Well, there's data mapping software.
Data mapping, what's that?
It helps you keep track of all your personal data.
So like where it's stored, who has access to it, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And then you have things like automated consent management platforms.
Consent management?
Yeah, to make sure you're collecting and using data in a way that complies with all the regulations.
Okay, so basically it's about automating some of those manual processes that can be so prone to human error.
Yeah, that's a big part of it.
And it's not just about efficiency, right?
No, not at all.
These tools can also help you identify potential risks.
Exactly. They can flag things that might slip through the cracks otherwise.
So you can be more proactive about compliance?
Right, because prevention is always better than cure.
Especially when it comes to something like this.
Absolutely. But I know what you're thinking.
What's that?
With so many different tools out there, it can be hard to know where to start.
It can be a bit overwhelming.
It can. But a good first step is to assess your needs.
Okay, so like, what are your biggest pain points?
Yeah. And where are you most vulnerable to compliance risks?
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
No, not at all. It's about finding the right tools for your specific business and your specific goals.
But technology is only part of the equation, right?
It is.
At the end of the day, compliance is about people.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Technology can automate tasks and provide insights, but it's the human element that really drives a culture of compliance.
That's so true.
It goes back to what we were talking about with Innovate.
Right. Their focus on building a sense of shared responsibility.
Yeah, everyone needs to understand that compliance is everyone's job.
From the CEO down to the intern.
And it's not just about following rules.
No, it's about doing business ethically and responsibly.
Exactly. Compliance should be part of your company's DNA.
It should be ingrained in everything you do.
So to wrap things up,
Dave.
we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
From GDPR to country-specific regulations to strategies for building a compliance culture.
And even the role of technology.
It's clear that there's no easy answer.
I know it's silver bullet.
But with a proactive approach, strong leadership, and a commitment to continuous learning.
You can definitely make it work.
And turn compliance into a source of strength.
Absolutely. It doesn't have to be a burden.
So as we leave our listeners today,
Yeah.
I want to leave you with a final thought.
Okay.
Knowing what we've discussed about the challenges, the strategies, the tools available, how would you approach building compliance in a new market? What aspects would you prioritize?
That's a great question.
It is something to really think about.
It is.
And remember, compliance is not a static concept.
No, it's constantly evolving.
So stay informed, stay adaptable, and keep striving for excellence in all that you do. Thanks for joining us.